Hey guys, tonight let's take a quiet step back in time. If you enjoy these slow, sleepy history journeys, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more. Imagine waking up to a straw mattress crawling with fleas and bed bugs. No memory foam, no comforter, just the cold, hard reality of medieval mornings. Think you'd survive breakfast? It's a bowl of pottage cooked days ago, served alongside bread stiff enough to break your teeth. And trust me, with no toothbrush or toothpaste, your teeth are already history. Could you handle it? Let's see how your day unfolds in the Middle Ages. Imagine opening your eyes, only to find them itching before you even sit up. The air feels damp, carrying a mix of earthy grime and something worse. Livestock odors bleeding into the room. You're lying on a straw mattress stuffed with what feels like half your yard's debris, the straws poking through its thin, rough sackcloth covering, and it's far from fluffy. Little black dots crawl between the stalks, fleas, likely more awake than you are, while head lice dig into your scalp as if they've been waiting all night for breakfast. And let's not forget the bedbugs, quietly partying in the cracks of the wooden frame. This is how you begin, itchy, cold, and dreading the day ahead. There's no such thing as a bedroom here. You open your eyes to find your family within arm's reach. Parents, siblings, perhaps even a grandparent, huddled up to avoid the freezing chill of a stone or timber house. Privacy, that didn't exist. If you and your family were lucky enough to own livestock, you might find a sleepy-looking goat standing just a few feet away, or hear the occasional snort of pigs stirring in the corner. They're not inside for fun, it's for warmth. Their body heat takes the edge off the bitter air, helpful in winter, revolting in summer. And they serve as living burglar alarms in a world where locks aren't exactly standard. Now, it's not just the smell and fleas you're contending with. The temperatures inside are less about comfort and more about survival. Winter feels like you're sleeping in a drafty barn, which, to be fair, you kind of are. The gap-ridden walls let in biting gusts of cold air that no wool blanket can truly fight off. You're wearing most of the clothing you own just to keep hypothermia at bay. And if it's summer, forget it. With no ceiling fans or cooling of any kind, the still air mingles with the sour, sweaty heat of your family and animals, creating an oppressive stink that sticks to your throat like a bad memory. Now think about where you sleep. A mattress that remembers the shape of your body, layers of soft sheets, a climate-controlled room where you can decide if it's too hot or cold with the turn of a dial. Luxuries fit for a king, and you didn't even notice them until now. In comparison, your medieval bed is a haphazard pile of straw or reeds that you hope hasn't rotted too much over time. No linen sheets, maybe a scratchy wool blanket if you're fortunate. Even if you can afford something fancier, like a feather bed, it's not free of critters. Fleas and lice don't discriminate based on social class. Nobles, congratulations, you're just itching in finer fabrics. Little pest problems might seem trivial, but they weren't just annoying. They were undermining your physical health. Lice meant endless scratching and infected sores over time. Flea bites swelled into painful welts that could leave you with infected wounds or scarred skin. And if disease broke out, say, the bubonic plague, the whole cycle starts with the fleas resting quietly under your blanket. You didn't need to see the plague doctor to know your mattress might kill you faster than it comforted you. But why sleep in these conditions at all, you ask? Because it's not like you had options. Livestock sharing your space did more than provide warmth. Think of them as medieval security cameras, except noisier. The line between indoors and outdoors was thin, and losing a sheep or two wasn't just inconvenient. It could ruin your family's entire year. The animals needed round-the-clock protection right alongside the humans. Owning livestock in the first place meant you were already doing better than many, so sharing your sleeping space was better than watching them get snatched overnight by thieves or predators. As you sit up on that straw-filled excuse for a bed, the morning air cuts through your blanket like a knife. There's no glass on your windows. Instead, thin shutters barely keep out wind or rain. You feel the floorboards under your feet, or worse, just the packed dirt, cold and uninviting, still holding last night's moisture. The daylight creeping through feels weak, filtered through grey skies, and your body aches from another night on what can graciously be called bedding. Sleeping comfortably isn't an expectation, it's an afterthought. And here's the twist. Getting out of bed isn't the end of your misery, it's only the start. As you shuffle toward whatever rough excuse for a door your hut has, things are going downhill fast. You're about to discover that whatever waits outside your cramped, mouldy home may somehow be worse than what's inside. Congratulations, you've survived the medieval bed. Now try surviving the medieval bathroom. Or, as you'll soon realize, the medieval lack of one. As you step out of bed, if that pile of scratching straw and sackcloth even deserves the name, you confront yet another challenge that no one in the Middle Ages could avoid: relief. And by relief, I mean the unpleasant task of finding somewhere, anywhere, to take care of your morning business. Forget porcelain toilets, private stalls, or even toilet paper. Your options are a crude wooden bucket, an outdoor pit, or, if you're lucky enough to live in a town, a public latrine that's neither clean nor comforting. For most people, the setup wasn't complicated. In your one-room home, there'd likely be a chamber pot, usually a simple, unadorned bucket that stayed somewhere close. You might even share this bucket with the rest of the family, meaning its contents built up steadily, stinking up the air before anyone got around to emptying it. And where do you dump that waste? Out the door. At best, there's a communal dung heap somewhere nearby. At worst, you just toss it into the street and hope it trickles away with the next rain. If you've ever walked past a garbage bin on a hot summer day, imagine multiplying that smell by 100. That was the scent that greeted you each morning as you opened your door. Now, if you lived in a town, you had the dubious luxury of public bathrooms, communal latrines set up for use by anyone and everyone. These were essentially rows of benches with holes cut into them. Privacy not included. Instead, you'd sit alongside neighbors or strangers, making awkward eye contact as you each pretended not to notice what was happening. The ventilation was non-existent, and the smell, you can't really blame it on just one person, was overpowering. Worse, these latrines didn't have a plumbing system in the way we'd understand it. Instead, everything dropped into trenches that often remained exposed or, if lucky, flowed into the same moats and waterways that people depended on for bathing and drinking water. Speaking of moats, let's shatter another medieval myth. The grand castles you might picture weren't spared from these bathroom realities. Even lords and ladies had to contend with something called a garderobe. Sounds fancy, right? It's not. A garderobe was essentially a glorified hole in the wall. Literally, a hole that funneled waste straight into the castle moat, or a cesspit beneath the building. And yes, that meant the same moat designed as a fortress defense was basically a waste-filled swamp circling the castle like a smelly moat of doom, fortified with, well, human ruin instead of crocodiles. But if you were paying attention, you've realized something by now. There's another lack you're confronting. No toilet paper. So what did medieval folk use instead? Leaves were a popular choice, or straw for those living out in the countryside. Soft moss, not bad if you happen to find some nearby. For townsfolk, scraps of rough cloth might do the job, or, you're not going to like this, an old handful of animal fur. The wealthier families might splurge on wool rags, but for the average medieval peasant, there wasn't much by way of toiletries. The act of wiping was less about getting clean, and more of an awkward ritual to get clean enough. Hygiene as we think of it simply didn't exist. By the way, the phrase clean enough doesn't stretch far when you consider that a lack of toilet paper was the least of their problems. Open sewers were a common sight in towns, small trenches that carried waste out into the street with no regard for where it might land. Heavy rain turned these narrow streets into rivers of sludge, the kind of place where you'd hesitate to step even with steel-toed boots, let alone the thin leather shoes medieval people wore. Add to this a potent mixture of animal droppings and random, unidentified fluids that leaked from workshops and homes, and you had streets that constantly reeked of disease. Those diseases weren't just unpleasant, they were deadly. Open waste disposal systems weren't just a health risk to the individual stepping over them. They were incubators for waterborne illnesses like cholera and dysentery, which spread rapidly in unsanitary environments. Town after town endured outbreaks of sickness due to contaminated water sources. The water you used to cook or drink was teeming with parasites and filth, a grim reminder that even the most basic acts of survival carried massive risks. This lack of sanitation wasn't an inconvenience, it was a death sentence for many. And if that wasn't bad enough, there's a strange humiliation connected to it all. Using these facilities wasn't just gross, it could feel deeply dehumanizing. Public latrines put everyone's shame on display. Dumping waste buckets outside invited glances from anyone passing by. And for peasants, squatting behind a bush with no cover while your neighbors walked past wasn't exactly empowering. As one source put it, medieval toileting is a humiliation ritual, a daily reminder of how rough life could be. But for all the discomforts and dangers, there was little alternative. People simply got on with it because they had no other choice. They could hardly imagine the luxury of modern bathrooms with perfectly flushing toilets, private stalls, and a roll of soft tissue always within reach. Even washing your hands, or the idea of doing so, was a concept most hadn't even dreamed up yet. To survive medieval life meant accepting indignities that most of us today wouldn't tolerate for an hour, let alone a lifetime. So as you step back and picture the reality of relieving yourself in the Middle Ages, the question to ask isn't, why did they live like that? But rather, how did they survive at all? Because make no mistake, even this small part of the day, just going to the bathroom, came with risks that could threaten your health, your dignity, and possibly even your life. And when it's all said and done, you don't get to return to a sink and splash some water on your face like you might today. Instead, you stumble forward, your stomach already growling, wondering where your next meal will come from, or if it will come at all. Let's move on to that part of medieval mornings, which is less about enjoying breakfast and more about simply finding enough food to survive. What's on the menu? Spoiler, it's not eggs and bacon. Let's take a look. Breakfast in the Middle Ages wasn't a meal you looked forward to. It was one you tolerated. Forget your steaming cup of coffee or the scent of sizzling bacon. Here, it's more of a survival routine and much less of a culinary adventure. Before you tackle the day's grueling labor, you've got one option waiting for you: pottage. Now, pottage sounds nice if you don't know what it is, A hearty stew, perhaps? Not quite. Imagine a thick, gloppy mixture of whatever scraps survived yesterday. Grains like barley, maybe some peas or onions if you were lucky, and just enough water to stretch it into something scoopable. It's been simmering for days in a pot that never entirely empties, with new ingredients constantly dumped in as they're scavenged or grown. Think of it as the distant, much sadder cousin of a modern crock-pot. Only there's no recipe, no timer beeping a convenient ready, just a pot sitting over the fire, evolving into something edible enough to keep you going, or at least edible in theory. The idea of fresh doesn't apply here. Whatever went into the pottage yesterday might already be past its prime today, and the flavor, well, let's just say it's functional. You're not finding savory herbs or pinches of costly spices in there. Peppermills and saffron didn't go with this lifestyle because, let me tell you, pepper alone could cost more than you earned in months. So you get the earthy, monotonous taste of overcooked vegetables and grains, thickened to the point where it feels like your spoon might stand up straight if you let go of it. And then there's the bread. In your time, bread might bring visions of crusty loaves, melt in your mouth softness, or that sweet smell wafting from bakeries. In medieval times, however, bread was different, thick, coarse, and as dense as a brick. It was made from rye or barley flour, sometimes with sawdust or ground-up acorns mixed in to stretch the supply during leaner times. Slicing through it required more effort than spreading butter on it, because spreading butter, or even owning butter regularly, was completely out of reach for most. If the bread's gone stale, which happens quickly considering the lack of preservatives, it's closer in texture to a dried stone than food. Trying to bite into it had its risks, especially if your teeth were already in bad shape, which, let's be real, medieval dental hygiene wasn't exactly stellar. Dry bread and pottage made breakfast feel less like a meal and more like something to endure, a quick calorie boost to get you through hours of relentless work ahead. But wait, what about something to wash it all down? Water would seem like an obvious choice, right? Except it wasn't. Medieval water was often more rival than friend. Filled with bacteria, parasites, and waste from human or animal sources, water from nearby rivers or wells was a game of chance with your health. You drank it, and you might not see tomorrow. The safer option. Ull. Not the cold, crisp craft brew you might sip today, but a weak, watered-down beer, brewed more for practicality than taste. The brewing process, which involved boiling water, killed off many of the harmful microorganisms that plagued water supplies. Ull wasn't a casual indulgence or just designated for adults. It was a necessary beverage, served even to children. A liquid calorie boost that wouldn't leave you writhing in agony later was about as good as it got. Now, before you romanticize this as a kind of rustic charm, consider what's missing. Fresh fruit. Sure, if you happen to live in an orchard during the harvest season, cheese or meat. Reserved for special occasions, if at all. Unless it's Sunday, a saint's feast day, or you're part of the rare household that can afford to own chickens without eating them in desperation. Such luxuries are few and far between. Most days, animal protein isn't anywhere near your table. And spices, forget about it. A sprinkle of pepper or a dash of cinnamon wasn't just rare. It was laughably inaccessible. Entire fortunes could be traded for what barely does your store-bought latte. In essence, breakfast isn't really about enjoying food. It's about getting enough calories into your body to survive until your next chance at food arrives. And even that isn't guaranteed. Food shortages weren't rare, particularly during harsh winters or after a bad harvest. Entire populations were at the mercy of the weather, or, if you lived under feudalism, the mercy of your local lord. A missed growing season didn't just mean less variety. It could mean you literally starved. Over time, the monotony of pottage wasn't just a dietary issue, it was psychological. Imagine waking up every day knowing exactly what was waiting for you on the table, or boiling away over a fire. It's not a question of, what do I feel like eating, so much as, what's left to be eaten? Most meals were stripped of any joy, because for peasants, the majority of the population, eating was strictly a survival mechanism. If you had food on your plate, you considered yourself lucky. If you were full by the end of the day, you were even luckier. What's interesting, though, is just how little medieval people thought of food in the way we do today. Meals weren't events, gatherings, or opportunities for indulgence. They were fuel stops. You didn't talk about enjoying your breakfast. You talked about whether there'd be enough left for supper. If you were lucky enough to have leftover bread or a decent portion of pottage in the pot, you counted it as a victory. And then there was the lingering question, was this breakfast even your first meal of the day? Medieval eating habits didn't necessarily align with modern concepts of breakfast, lunch, and dinner. In many cases, breakfast wasn't considered a proper meal, especially among the working class. Just a mouthful of whatever was available, eaten quickly before heading straight into hours of labor. Only the wealthiest families or monks adhering to specific schedules bothered with a formal breakfast. And even then, it wasn't exactly extravagant. So there you are, spooning lukewarm pottage into your mouth before biting hesitantly into a hunk of borderline inedible bread. Not because it's enjoyable, but because you don't have much of a choice. You wash it down with a mouthful of weak ale that carries the faint bitterness of dissent. Not a taste you savor, but one you're grateful for because it doesn't make you sick. As you eat, you might not even notice that the stew's texture has become slightly grainier overnight, or that the bread is starting to go hard. Food was food, and that was about as far as the thought went, unless it was physically gone. Here's the kicker. None of this is enough. Your stomach might not even feel full, but there's no time to sit and think about it. Food shortages and poor nutrition don't only leave you hungry, they drain your energy. Now imagine fueling your body, which is about to endure back-breaking labor all day, with this diet. No protein bars, no leafy greens offering clean energy, and certainly no sugary snacks for quick bursts of motivation. Everything you've eaten will burn off quickly as your body fights the unrelenting physical demands placed on it. So, as you finish your meal, the day stretches ahead of you like a looming challenge. You don't get to sip a second cup of anything and scroll through your phone to relax. You get to step into the dirt, pick up your tools, and hope your morning pottage carries you long enough to make it back home tonight. But before you can even step outside, there's another challenge. You need to get dressed for the day. And trust me, your medieval wardrobe isn't about style or comfort. Let's take a closer look. Imagine standing in yesterday's clothes, because that's all you have, and realizing you'll probably wear them tomorrow too. In fact, you'll likely keep wearing the same outfit for weeks, maybe months, until it either falls apart or stinks so badly even you can't stand it anymore. And yes, there's no underwear separating you from your rough, scratchy wool tunic. That layer of discomfort rubbing against your skin all day. It's just part of the routine. Let's start with your basic wardrobe. For most people, it was staggeringly simple. Your main piece of clothing is made of wool, coarse and scratchy wool, that's been stitched into a tunic or a shift. The feel of it isn't what you'd call pleasant. and the edges where the seams rub against your skin can become raw with time. Linen might be an option underneath if you're lucky or slightly better off, but it's still nowhere near the softness of anything you'd find in your closet today. And since washing clothes in medieval times wasn't a regular occurrence, your layers of fabric quickly stiffened with dirt, sweat, and the constant presence of the uninvited guests clinging to your body. Fleas, lice, and possibly a bedbug or two from your mattress. Parasites weren't just a nuisance. They were woven into the fabric of day-to-day life, literally. Fleas hopped around in the folds of your tunic. Lice nested in the seams, and you itched constantly. Scratching became as common as walking. It was just something you did. There wasn't a magical cure or treatment, so the raw patches on your skin from constant scratching were unavoidable. If you've ever found a single itchy tag on a shirt unbearable, just imagine your entire outfit being the cause. But it doesn't stop at itching. Wearing unwashed clothes for days or weeks on end had consequences beyond the immediate discomfort. For starters, there's the smell. Without modern detergents or deodorants, your tunic begins to take on the scent of everything you've been through. Sweat, dirt, and whatever other grime the day throws at you. The result? Clothes that smell like a compost pile that's been left to marinate in a pigsty. And once that stench settles in, good luck getting it out. Washing your clothes was a grueling process, a rare, special occasion if the weather permitted. You needed to haul buckets of water, heat it over an open flame, and scrub your tunic against a board with ashes or homemade soap. That's assuming you even had soap to begin with. Otherwise, the best you could hope for was rinsing out some of the dirt and convincing yourself that damp equals clean. What's more, clothing was expensive. A single tunic could take weeks to weave and sew, assuming you had the materials, so most people only owned 1 or 2 full outfits. If something ripped, you fixed it, usually with whatever was on hand. New clothes weren't an option unless you happened to be both skilled and wealthy, which, let's face it, you probably weren't. So the holes in your shoes stayed there, the edges of your tunic grew frayed, and your overall look leaned less toward rustic chic and more toward threadbare misery. Speaking of shoes, let's talk about what's probably not on your feet. Footwear, much like clothing, wasn't a guarantee. If you did have shoes, they were crudely stitched together from untreated leather. Minimal support, zero comfort, and no protection from the elements. You walked through the same muddy streets or frozen ground every day, and your shoes soaked it all in like sponges. Most peasants didn't even bother with them unless it was absolutely necessary. Going barefoot wasn't just common, it was the default. Your feet were exposed to sharp rocks, animal waste, and any number of things you'd rather not think about. Injuries and infections weren't just risks, they were eventualities. But clothing wasn't just about covering modesty or protecting yourself from the elements. It also had to keep you warm because medieval homes weren't what you'd call cozy. With no proper heating or insulation, winters could feel like you were living in a drafty barn. To combat the cold, people layered their clothes, piling on extra garments if they had them. The problem? More layers just trapped more sweat. So, while you might feel slightly warmer at first, the wool and linen quickly became covered in grime and body odor. Comfort didn't factor into these decisions. It was all about survival. If you were suffocatingly warm in the summer or barely warm enough in the winter, it didn't matter. Daily misery seemed like part of the deal. And then there's the fact that this was your best outfit, the one you wore nearly every day because you didn't have a backup. Special occasions didn't mean new clothes. They meant cleaning the ones you already had, maybe brushing off some stains to make them look presentable. The idea of owning multiple pairs of pants or having anything resembling a wardrobe is laughably modern. Clothes, like food, were about necessity. You had just enough to make it through, and if something tore, you made it last for as long as humanly possible. Still, there was even more to this discomfort. The materials themselves weren't exactly doing you any favors. Wool, while warm, felt like rough sandpaper against your skin. Linen might have been softer, but it still couldn't compare to modern cotton or synthetic fabrics. Over time, the constant rubbing of these coarse materials on your skin could lead to rashes and irritation. Add in the infestations of fleas and lice, and you've got an outfit practically designed to make you miserable. And let's not forget about hygiene, or the general lack thereof. Bathing in this era wasn't what we'd call frequent. For the average person, washing your body, let alone your clothes, was rare. Maybe you'd dunk yourself in a river during the summer, but in the colder months, cleaning yourself became an afterthought. Layers of dirt and oil built up on your skin, making the itching even worse. Combined with the smell of unwashed clothing, your body became a walking testament to the medieval philosophy of good enough. Now, comparing this to modern times might feel almost unfair. These days, you can pull a fresh shirt out of a drawer, toss dirty clothes into a washing machine, or replace an old pair of sneakers with a quick trip to the store. Even the idea of layering clothes for warmth feels more like a fashion choice than a survival strategy. But back then, being dressed didn't mean being comfortable. It didn't even mean being clean. It just meant being prepared enough to keep going, even if every layer you put on added to the irritation carving into your skin. So, as you struggled to tie the laces on your barely there leather shoes or yank your itchy wool tunic into place, you realize something important. There's no escape. Dressing in the Middle Ages wasn't just about covering yourself. It was about enduring another layer of discomfort on top of everything else. And if you think the misery ends here, think again. Because while your clothes scratch your skin and the damp air clings to your body, there's another kind of discomfort creeping up on you. One that starts with your teeth, or what's left of them. Let's talk about the smiling horrors of medieval dental care, or the lack of it. By the time you hit 25 in the Middle Ages, your mouth has become a battlefield, and not the kind with winners. Most of your teeth are either rotted to the root, blackened, or missing altogether. Congratulations, your smile now resembles something you'd expect to find in a haunted crypt. And here's the kicker. This wasn't unusual. Oral health in the medieval world was about as common as a warm bath, which is to say, almost non-existent. Let's start with the basics, or lack of them. There were no toothbrushes, no toothpaste, no floss. Mouthwash, not unless you count rinsing with wine or vinegar, a practice that was more about pretending to help than actually addressing the decay happening in your gums. Some people may have chewed on twigs to dislodge bits of food, but a twig isn't exactly a high-tech solution. Without any real preventative care, teeth were left to fend for themselves against years of food residue, gradual decay, and the constant assault of medieval grit. Speaking of food, the medieval diet wasn't doing anyone's teeth any favors. Coarse bread, bulked up with barley, rye, or even sawdust, was a major culprit. And yes, you heard that right, sawdust. Bread wasn't just rough on the stomach, it was like eating sandpaper for your teeth. Meals often contained so much grit and stone from poorly milled grain that every bite shaved away at tooth enamel. Porridge, another staple, wasn't much better. While modern sugar hadn't yet entered most people's diets, decay wasn't just about sweetness. Over time, their teeth wore down from sheer mechanical abuse, leaving them sensitive, jagged, or edged with cavities. Even for the wealthier crowd who could afford more exciting diets, things didn't improve much. Sugar was becoming a luxury item at this time, and its novelty often outweighed concerns about what it was doing to their gums. But medieval society didn't associate hygiene with health. They had no idea that cleaning their teeth could prevent pain or infections. For most, the daily discomfort from a toothache was just part of life, like bad weather, always lingering in the background. And toothaches weren't minor inconveniences. They were throbbing, relentless terrors. Imagine a constant pulsing pain in your mouth that you couldn't escape. Eating, speaking, even breathing could amplify the discomfort. It was the kind of pain that made you consider praying, drinking, or, if you were brave enough, trying to yank the tooth out yourself. And when the pain became unbearable, there was one last resort: the barber surgeon. Now don't let the name fool you into thinking this was a skilled professional in a pristine room, with sanitized tools and calming bedside manners. Barber surgeons were quite literally barbers who also dabbled in basic medical procedures, which included pulling teeth. You'd sit down on a rough wooden stool, likely surrounded by a few unlucky onlookers, and the barber would bring out their tools, iron hooks, pliers and clamps that looked more suited to medieval torture than dental care. No anesthesia, of course, because it didn't exist. Instead, they might offer you a rag to bite down on, or suggest you drink heavily beforehand. Extractions weren't smooth procedures. Often, they weren't even successful. Teeth could break under the pressure, leaving roots stuck in the gums. And while the idea of dealing with a toothache like this sounds horrifying, the aftermath wasn't any better. With no knowledge of sterilization, the tools were likely covered in blood and bacteria from previous patients. The result? Infections. And back then, an infection wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a possible death sentence. Without antibiotics, something as simple as an infected tooth could lead to sepsis. Pain turned to swelling. The swelling turned into fever. And before you knew it, you'd find yourself headed for your funeral in the 1300s, all because that broken molar wasn't removed cleanly. If you're wincing just listening to this, imagine trying to go to work after all this. Imagine heading out to start a physically demanding day, tilling fields, hauling water, or grinding grain, with half your jaw throbbing and a poorly removed tooth oozing in your mouth. Pain wasn't just an interruption in medieval life. It was a constant, dragging burden. And with no Advil or numbing gels to take the edge off, you could only grit your teeth, assuming you had any left to grit. Even for those who somehow escaped tooth infections, the long-term effects of neglected oral care were impossible to avoid. Gums grew swollen and diseased, bleeding at the slightest touch. Breath. Let's be honest, it probably smelled like the inside of a decayed barn. Rotting teeth weren't just a personal discomfort, they were a communal reality. There was no hiding bad oral hygiene when everything about it. Missing teeth, exposed roots, swollen gums, black decay was on full display every time you opened your mouth. All of this makes you appreciate the sheer miracle of modern dental care. Think about it. You've got toothbrushes designed by engineers, toothpaste scientifically formulated to strengthen enamel, and mouthwash that can eliminate bacteria in 30 seconds. You can pop into a dentist's office for a cleaning or to fill a cavity, a far cry from sitting in a barber's shop with a rusty hook coming at your face. Even a mundane trip to the drugstore to buy floss wasn't an option for medieval people. They didn't understand what those tools could have done for them even if they had them. But in the Middle Ages, even these small health issues could ripple into something much bigger. For many, chronic pain wore them down mentally and physically. A single infected tooth could weaken a body already struggling to survive on limited nutrition. And for all the toughness medieval life required, even tough people had limits. Dentistry back then felt less like a solution and more like a gamble. You acted out of desperation, hoping for the best while bracing for the worst. So how did anyone manage to function under these conditions? The unsettling answer is simple. They didn't think about it much. Pain was normalized, suffering was a given, and life marched forward regardless of whatever might be rotting inside their mouths. You could either endure it, risk a dangerous extraction, or let the decay spread and hope it didn't kill you first. No one expected a perfect smile or longevity, when the cruel reality was simply making it through one more day. By now, the picture is clear. You're dressed in itchy, flea-ridden clothing, your stomach barely satisfied with a bowl of bland pottage, and your gums are on fire from a tooth that might fall out tomorrow, or might kill you if you don't do something about it. Everything about medieval survival required resilience in the face of debilitating discomfort. Even something as small as a toothache could cascade into life-threatening consequences. But here's the thing. People didn't stop because they couldn't afford to. There was no time to sit and nurse your pain or wonder about alternative options. Daily survival didn't pause for injured mouths. The fields still needed to be plowed, the water still needed to be fetched, and every waking moment demanded more physically than most modern people experience in a week. You didn't get rest. You worked through the agony because you didn't have a choice. And that's what's next. You think labor today is hard? Imagine trying to make it through a sunrise to sunset workday while your entire body is crying out for relief. Let's get into what it took to get through just one day of medieval labor. Spoiler, it's not just back-breaking, it's life-breaking. Your day starts with the sun. It has to because that's when your only light rolls across the sky. The concept of free time, morning breaks, or even weekends, forget it. Your work begins as soon as the rooster crows and doesn't let up until the sun disappears behind the horizon. And when the sun runs the schedule like that, it doesn't care whether you're exhausted, injured, or just plain sick of the grind. Your only option is to keep moving. Because stopping, even for a moment, isn't something you can afford. For most people, life revolves around the land. If you're a peasant, which about 90% of the medieval population was, you'll spend your day in service to the earth and to someone else's profit. You're not working for yourself. You're farming fields you don't own, using tools you probably borrowed, and handing over most of what you produce to a lord who likely doesn't even know your name. That's the deal under the feudal system. You get a plow, a roof over your head, and maybe protection from raiders in exchange for your loyalty and all the fruits, or grains rather, of your back-breaking labor. It's not an agreement, it's survival by compliance. Picture this. The chores start immediately. The fields stretch out in front of you, endless under a grey sky. Your plow is a simple wooden frame. If you're lucky, you have an ox to pull it along, though you probably don't. Most likely, it's your own shoulders bearing the weight, trudging through the dirt one step at a time. Each row of soil you turn means bending to pull rocks free, yanking weeds by the roots, then sowing seeds in the still frozen ground if spring hasn't fully arrived. There's no tractor to speed things up, no machinery to help manage the load. It's pure, relentless muscle all day long, and you're not done when one field is plowed. there's always another waiting. Carrying water feels like its own punishment. The nearest well is half a mile away, and the buckets you haul are heavy before they're even full. But you can't skip this task. Not when your crops need it, not when the animals need it, and definitely not when your family needs to drink something other than the weak ale they sip to avoid the poisoned water. Each trip back and forth eats away at your time and energy. Your shoulders ache, your legs shake, and the wooden handles dig into your hands. But if you stop, none of it gets done. And then what? Starvation? Thirst? You don't stop. And just when you think there's no possible way to squeeze more work into the day, remember this: it's not just farming. There's your home to maintain too. The roof's wood shingles have started to sag. They need replacing before tonight's rain. The firewood pile is low, barely enough for tonight, so you'll need to chop more, even though your arms already feel like they might drop off at any second. The courtyard, let's be honest, the patch of dirt outside your door, has turned into a minefield of animal filth. You need to shovel that out before anyone accidentally tracks it into the house. Every task on your list feels urgent, and there's no help coming. It's just you and whoever in your family can stand without collapsing. Women had it even harder. Peasant women didn't just farm. They managed homes while working the fields. They fetched water, cleaned, cooked, spun wool, fed livestock, baked bread, and raised children, all at the same time. If you think of those jobs as chores in the modern sense, you're being too generous. These were critical jobs for keeping everyone alive, not just annoying to-dos that piled up. Washing clothes, for instance, was a day-long ordeal that involved scrubbing fabric in cold streams, wringing it by hand, then drying it under unreliable weather conditions. And that's assuming the fabric didn't rot or fray in the process. Every aspect of labor carried the same energy-draining, back-breaking effort. Even kids weren't spared. Childhood stopped the moment you could lift something heavier than your own body. By the age of 5 or 6, you'd be working alongside grown adults. Maybe you carried light equipment or helped herd animals. By 10, you were probably strong enough to plow or haul water, so you did. There was no gradual introduction to the labor force. If you could work, you worked. What made it worse was how little protection you had. Injuries were a constant threat, and there was no safety protocol, no compensation for time off, and absolutely no tolerance for excuses. If you fell while hauling water and broke your wrist, tough luck. The bucket still needed carrying. If you strained your back while tilling the soil, you kept going. The feudal system didn't care about your injuries. It cared about output. Fail to produce, and you might lose your place in the system altogether, replaced by someone just as desperate who could take your spot. That often meant you'd lose everything: your home, your access to land, and the support of the community that had once relied on you. From there, things only went downhill. Homelessness, starvation, and possibly death. And if the work itself wasn't enough of a torment, let's not forget the environment. Weather didn't just complicate life. It crushed you under its weight. Under freezing winter skies, you'd march out in thin clothing that barely shielded you from the cold. Mud would freeze around your feet as you worked, the icy ground cutting into your shoes, or directly into your skin if you couldn't afford footwear. The snow wasn't magical. It was a death sentence if it lingered too long, locking the earth in a grip so tight that tools couldn't penetrate it. In summer, the exact opposite happened. Scorching days left sweat dripping from your unfinished tunic, soaking into the wool, until you were drenched and suffocating beneath it. The sun burned your skin as you worked, the heat rising off the soil, until it felt like an oven surrounding you. Your tools, if they could even be called that, weren't helping. The best you've got is a wooden hoe that splinters in your hands, or a rusted sickle that leaves blisters after an hour of cutting. No gloves, no ergonomic handles, just raw, bare-knuckled labor. Blisters and calluses, normal. Cracked skin that bled, also normal. Infections from those cuts. The rule, not the exception. You didn't hope for safety. You hoped for healing that didn't require risking your life by asking the barber surgeon to hack off a limb. But here's the real tragedy. There was no escape. The system locked you into this life from birth, with no upward mobility and no chance to change your destiny. You could work yourself to the bone day after day, and not a single ounce of effort would bring you closer to a better life. The feudal system ensured that peasants remained peasants forever. You owed your labor, your crops, and, if the situation came to it, your life to someone who barely knew you existed. And yet, somehow, people endured. Not happily, but because they had to. Surviving the workday meant not just enduring the physical toll, but also swallowing the emotional weight of knowing you'd wake up tomorrow to do it all over again. If you managed to make it from sunrise to sunset, still standing, still breathing, that was about as close to a win as you could get. Surviving a single day wasn't just hard, it was a genuine accomplishment. But here's a question. What about the days when the weather made that work almost impossible? When the sky turned against you, and the elements became as much of a threat as the labor itself? Well, welcome to the next chapter of medieval life. Enduring the cruelties of nature in a world with no insulation and no escape. Let's talk about what happens when even the weather has it out for you. Winter felt less like a season and more like a full-scale assault when you lived in the Middle Ages. Your home, whether it was a modest wooden hut or a slightly grander stone structure, offered about as much protection as a canvas tent. Think about it. Wooden walls full of gaps, a thin roof of thatch barely keeping out the elements, and windows covered with fabric or animal hide instead of glass. These weren't cozy, insulated spaces. They were shells, crude, fragile attempts at shelter. The cold didn't just creep in. It poured freely, filling every corner of the room like an icy fog you couldn't escape. You might think, well, light a fire. Of course, there was a fireplace or hearth in the center of the home, but the heat it provided was wildly inefficient. A roaring fire could warm whatever was directly in front of it, but step 2 feet away and you were back to shivering. Worse, firewood wasn't easy to come by. Remember, cutting enough timber to last through the winter required hours of back-breaking work, without a chainsaw naturally. And then you had to ration it carefully to ensure the pile didn't run out before the frost did. So instead of sitting cozy by a crackling fire, you'd huddle near dying embers, wrapped in your one woolen tunic. Fingers and toes stiffened, noses froze, and waking up to frost inside the house wasn't just possible, it was routine. Frostbite, a constant risk. Hands and feet were the first to go, as calloused fingers and worn-out shoes couldn't keep the bitter cold from sinking in. You tried to work despite the chill, milking a cow or repairing a tool with hands that cracked, bled, and refused to move properly. And at night, no amount of layering felt like enough. Blankets, if you had them at all, were scratchy and thin. Animals might be brought inside to share their body heat, a practical if unsanitary solution. But even then the medieval winter seeped into your bones, a heaviness you carried with you throughout your frozen day. And just when you think the warmth of spring might finally save you, summer arrives and turns your home into something closer to a bread oven. The same walls that let gusts of cold air in during the winter now did nothing to stop the sweltering heat. Medieval homes were poorly ventilated, trapping warmth and turning every corner into a boiling, stifling space. Imagine sweating through your clothes, not just once or twice, but all day, every day. Changing into something cooler wasn't an option unless you happened to own another tunic. Spoiler, most people didn't. Outdoor work didn't stop because of the heat. Fields still needed ploughing. Wheat, barley and rye still needed harvesting. And there you were, hunched over under a relentless sun, drenched in sweat. Straw hats, if you had one, provided limited protection, but there was no miracle product like sunscreen to keep your skin safe. Sunburn wasn't just a discomfort. It was something you endured alongside exhaustion, or, if you were unlucky, heat stroke. The worst part? Once night fell, the indoors wasn't much better. Medieval homes didn't cool down after the sunset. They simply went from scalding to stuffy. Sleep remained a challenge, especially with flies and mosquitoes buzzing around, drawn in by the odors of sweat, food and livestock. And heat brought another danger: rot. You couldn't store food safely under these conditions, so grains and pottage went bad faster. Meat, if you somehow had any, would spoil unless it was heavily salted or smoked, methods few could afford to use regularly. Summer abundance wasn't so abundant after all, when spoilage constantly undermined your work. Hunger and nausea became as much a part of your daily rhythm as the sun rising and setting. The dampness was its own kind of villain. Medieval homes almost constantly fought against moisture, whether it was brought on by morning dew, summer humidity, or days of heavy rain. Thatch roofs leaked if they weren't meticulously maintained, and even stone walls oozed dampness on foggy days. This created the perfect environment for mold to thrive. You wouldn't see it growing behind drywall like you might today. There was no drywall to be found, but it clung to the corners of your living space, spreading across damp wooden beams and straw bedding. Mold wasn't just gross, it contributed to sickness. The air inside your home often carried musty, choking odors that aggravated existing illness and invited new ones to take root. Illness thrived in these extremes. Cold winters weakened immune systems, while damp, poorly ventilated homes allowed bacteria and fungi to flourish. Upper respiratory infections ran rampant when the air hung heavy with smoke from the hearth and mold from the walls. Heat waves drained your strength, pushing already malnourished bodies to collapse when forced to work in the fields. Dehydration, fevers, coughs. All of these symptoms highlighted a cycle of weather-induced sickness that no one could truly escape. In a cruel twist, the weather also dictated productivity. Farming, the backbone of medieval economies, relied entirely on seasons that often worked against people instead of with them. Spring rains might delay planting. Scorching summers could shrivel crops before they matured. Frost arriving early in fall meant an abrupt end to the harvest. Each extreme left you with less to eat and less to store for hard months ahead. And winter, of course, shut down nearly everything. Frozen soil couldn't be ploughed, livestock huddled instead of grazing, and trading routes became impassable under snow or flooding. Months of toil could disappear in a single bad season, and starvation wasn't theoretical. It was a documented reality that followed on the heels of poor weather. Now think for a second about what we have today. Homes with central heating and cooling, double glazed windows that seal out drafts, air conditioning units that make hot days bearable, and electric heaters that bring warmth at the push of a button. Sweating too much? Just adjust the thermostat. Too cold? Pull on a hoodie made from soft, finely woven fabric that medieval folks wouldn't have believed existed. And if a storm rips through, you're not immediately facing weeks of misery unless the power lines go down. For medieval people, modern climate control systems would have seemed like science fiction, or maybe even some kind of sorcery. The ability to sit comfortably while the world rages on outside, to pick up a jacket or flip on a fan, knowing the weather couldn't touch you. It would have felt like the kind of comfort reserved for celestial beings, not for mortals hauling buckets of water or stomping mud to patch a roof. Ultimately, the weather wasn't just inconvenient, it was oppressive. It weighed down on every decision, dictating how much you worked, how much you ate, how often you got sick, and even how long you lived. Every extreme, whether frigid cold or sweltering heat, felt like a reminder of how precarious survival really was. No insulation, no climate control, no escape. Just layer upon layer of discomfort, stacking endlessly as the seasons spun endlessly on. If sweating through your clothes in the sun or shivering beside a fire sounds miserable, it's about to get worse. Weather wasn't the only way nature worked against you. Your water supply, something we barely think twice about today, was often less an ally and more a weapon waiting to strike. Let's take a closer look at what medieval people faced when even staying hydrated meant taking your life into your hands. Drink water and you might die. It sounds dramatic, but in medieval times, that was the simple truth. Water sources that looked fresh and clean to the naked eye were often breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites. Rivers where you'd collect water were polluted, not just by the waste pouring in from chamber pots emptied into the streets, but by actual decomposing animals or even human remains upstream. Every sip was a gamble, and the odds weren't good. The water wasn't refreshing. It was, as one source puts it, trying to murder you quietly. To understand just how dangerous medieval water was, you have to remember how filthy the medieval environment was overall. Open sewers ran alongside streets, carrying human waste, animal droppings, and whatever unidentifiable liquids leaked out of shops or homes. When it rained, these charming rivers of filth overflowed, spreading contaminants even further. Urban streets became a mix of sludge and rot, and the runoff didn't just disappear. It found its way into the streams and rivers people depended on. The same water you pulled to wash vegetables or fill a cooking pot was teeming with danger. There was no concept of filtration or boiling water for safety unless you were brewing beer. And that brings us to the surprising savior of medieval hydration: ale. Yes, beer, more specifically, weak ale, was the safer option for medieval people, even kids. It wasn't the kind of beer you might picture today, with smooth flavors and fancy labels. This ale was a practical creation, brewed more for survival than enjoyment. The brewing process involved boiling water, which helped kill off a lot of the bacteria and parasites that had been quietly waiting to ruin your life. As the liquid cooled, it was fermented with grains, creating something weak in alcohol, but, as one source puts it, strong in survival. Drinking ale wasn't about getting drunk, though that could happen if you overindulged. It was about making sure your next drink didn't land you on your deathbed. Even children drank beer, which might sound alarming at first, but think of the alternative. Letting them drink water carried the risk of diseases that spread through contaminated sources, like dysentery or cholera. Dysentery, in particular, was a brutal way to go. It didn't just disrupt your system, it drained you of life, one agonizing moment at a time, as your body turned against itself. Streets filled with open sewers were essentially perfect incubators for illnesses like this, and people had to adapt or die. Beer became the solution even for the youngest members of society. It was weak enough not to cause intoxication in small amounts, but strong enough to stand between you and a potentially fatal bout of sickness. Of course, brewing beer wasn't simple or quick. It took time, resources, and a fair amount of physical labor. The process started with grinding barley or other grains, then mixing them with water to make a mash. This sludge-like mixture was boiled, releasing fermentable sugars. Once it was strained and cooled, yeast was added, and the brew was left to ferment for days. The result? Something that resembled modern beer in appearance, but had far less alcohol and a much more functional purpose. A family might keep a supply on hand, prioritizing it over other luxuries, or sacrificing luxuries entirely to gather the grains needed for brewing. Stronger ales, which required more resources and better brewing techniques, were reserved for special occasions or wealthier households. For the average peasant, weak beer was a daily staple, not a treat. But let's not romanticize medieval ale too much. It wasn't always consistent in flavor or quality, because medieval brewers didn't exactly have quality control. Sometimes your ale came out sour, sometimes it barely fermented, and occasionally it could make you almost as sick as bad water, depending on how it was stored or handled. Still, it was usually the safer bet. The brewing process gave it an edge over drinking straight from the river, even if it sometimes left you holding your nose as you drank. The reliance on beer wasn't just a rural or peasant phenomenon. Towns and cities were no better off when it came to water. In fact, urban centers made things worse. There was simply more waste, more people dumping chamber pots, more animals on the streets leaving droppings in their wake, more runoff trickling into rivers that were already struggling under the weight of pollutants. Wells within city walls were rarely deep enough to escape contamination, especially when streets above them became saturated with waste after heavy rain. It was a cascading mess of filth, and it showed no mercy. Even monasteries, generally cleaner and more organized than most medieval spaces, brewed beer for survival. Monks weren't cracking open kegs for fun. They were producing a drinkable, safe alternative to water for themselves and the surrounding community. Beer might also be given to travelers or pilgrims as part of a monastery's hospitality. It became a necessary craft, not a luxury, and its role in medieval life extended far beyond the tavern. But sometimes, even beer wasn't enough to save you. Sanitation was so poor during this time that disease outbreaks became unavoidable. Waterborne illnesses spread like wildfire through villages, towns, and cities alike. Dysentery, cholera, and even typhoid didn't just threaten individuals. They claimed entire communities. If contaminated water entered a town's supply, there was little anyone could do. By the time people realized what was happening, it was often too late to stop the spread. Clean water was a luxury, not a right, and most couldn't afford to access better options even if they existed. In this environment, even staying hydrated became a fight for survival. Every option carried some level of risk. Drink the water, and you might die from an illness that slowly tears you apart. Avoid it, and you run the risk of dehydration as you try to make it through another grueling day of labor. Or you could hope that beer, the lesser of two evils, would carry you through. It's no wonder then that weak ale became so tightly woven into the fabric of medieval life. It was one of the few reliable defenses against a world that seemed determined to poison its inhabitants. Imagine the contrast with your life today. You turn the tap, and clean, safe water pours out. You don't think twice about drinking it, cooking with it, or even splashing it across your face. If anything, you're probably more worried about the fluoride content than deadly bacteria. When's the last time you thought of a beer as a survival tool? These days, it's a social choice, not a matter of life and death. You can sip a craft brew while debating the flavor profile, not wondering if it's your best shot at surviving the week. In medieval times, though, survival meant constant compromise. You weren't choosing between safe and clean. You were deciding which risk you could live with. Contaminated water might kill you quickly. Beer was safer, but it couldn't erase all the dangers, especially when the environment itself worked against you. There was no perfect solution. Staying hydrated came with the unshakable weight of uncertainty, day after day. So even the simple act of taking a drink turned into a strategic decision with life-altering consequences. It's a grim reminder of just how precarious life was in the Middle Ages. Hydration wasn't refreshing. It was survival at its most basic, where every drop represented a careful, uneasy balance between life and death. And speaking of life or death decisions, let's turn to something even more unpredictable: medieval justice. Because if you think the water supply was dangerous, wait until you hear what passed for law and order. Congratulations, you've made it this far into your medieval day. But here's the hard truth: most people wouldn't make it much farther in real life. Statistically speaking, you wouldn't see age 40. That might sound shocking, but in the Middle Ages, death was everywhere, and life was fragile. It wasn't just something that happened to you eventually. It was woven into the rhythm of everyday existence. You woke up with it, worked beside it, and sooner rather than later, you'd probably meet it. The reasons for this grim reality were endless. Let's start with disease, the invisible predator lurking behind every corner. Illness wasn't picky. It didn't matter if you were a hard-working peasant or a wealthy lord. Disease didn't discriminate. Infections, fevers, plagues, all of them could take you out in days, sometimes hours, and there wasn't much anyone could do about it. Small injuries, like a scratch from a farm tool or a blister on your foot, could quickly become infected. And because there were no antibiotics, that tiny wound could easily develop into sepsis or gangrene. Your body would turn against itself, and the fight would end before it even really began. Now imagine dealing with more serious illnesses. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid were all part of the medieval greatest hits. As you probably figured out by now, the unsanitary conditions didn't make things any easier. Contaminated water was a constant threat. Open sewers didn't help. And even the food you ate had its risks. You couldn't just pop some medicine or head to a clean clinic. Instead, you'd call in a local healer, or worse, a barber surgeon. They might offer a poultice made of questionable ingredients, or, if things got desperate, start bleeding you to remove the sickness. Spoiler alert, none of this really worked. Most treatments did more harm than good, either weakening you further or infecting wounds that weren't even the problem to begin with. But even if you managed to dodge the immediate dangers of disease, malnutrition was waiting in the wings. Food scarcity cast a long shadow over medieval life, especially if the harvest failed. Bread, your primary staple, was often bulked up with less than nutritious fillers like acorns or even sawdust in hard times. Vegetables were seasonal luxuries, not guarantees, and access to protein, like meat or dairy, was limited at best. The result? a diet that kept you alive, but just barely. It didn't take much for these calorie deficits to weaken your immune system and leave you vulnerable to every ailment sweeping through town. Surviving winter or a famine year, a temporary victory, not a given. And let's not ignore how dangerous the work itself could be. Farming, for instance, sounds straightforward until you remember you're cutting hay with a sharp scythe using bare hands, or trying to move a heavy plough with no modern tools. One wrong move, and that minor accident becomes a fatal one. A twisted ankle could leave you unable to walk to the well for water, let alone tend the fields. Fall from a roof while repairing your home. That injury might never heal. The same goes for burns from cooking, injuries from handling livestock, or even accidents involving carts or horses. OSHA wasn't a thing in the 14th century, so safety was more of a suggestion than an expectation. But even the most careful individuals couldn't account for larger forces. The looming threat of violence added another layer to the ever-present danger. Bandits prowled roads. Localized conflicts between lords could turn your village into a battleground. And let's not forget that outright war was a regular occurrence. Soldiers marching through medieval towns weren't exactly gentle, and the collateral damage they caused was often devastating. If you weren't killed outright, you might end up injured, or worse, displaced. Left to wander on foot in search of food and shelter that probably didn't exist. Survival was a non-stop negotiation with the chaos around you. For children, the odds were even worse. Nearly half of all kids died before they turned 5. Think about that for a second. 50% of children didn't make it to kindergarten age, and you can imagine what that did to families. Parents lived with the constant fear that their child's cough might turn into something deadlier, or that the coming winter might be the one that takes them. Infant mortality rates were so high that in some cases, children weren't baptized or even named until their survival seemed more certain. If they made it through those early years, great. If they didn't, well, you mourned, buried them, and kept going. As harsh as that sounds, it was how people coped. Grief was a private weight carried silently because death was so common. It almost didn't give you the space to stop and process it. And when death came, medieval funeral practices were as pragmatic as they were reflective of the times. If you were lucky, your body would be buried in a local churchyard, close to hallowed ground. But burials didn't mean permanence. Grave sites were often reused when space ran out. Your remains might eventually be moved or discarded to make room for someone freshly deceased. For children and infants, the burials were typically simple and unmarked. Older adults might see some small ceremonies, but for the average peasant, death wasn't often marked by grandeur. Coffins were rare, and embalming was unheard of unless you were nobility. Instead, a body might be wrapped in cloth and lowered into the earth within a day of passing. The church bells ringing in your village, probably signaling yet another burial. Even your death wasn't entirely yours to manage. The church played a significant role in shaping attitudes around mortality. Death wasn't just an end. It was a transition to the afterlife. Giving alms or ensuring your children lit candles for you at the altar wasn't just tradition. It was insurance for your soul. But while the church painted death as inevitable, it didn't erase the constant fear of it. People saw death coming for them at every turn. Superstitions, prayers, and rituals tried to keep it at bay. But there was always the unspoken truth. Most of you weren't going to win this fight. The high infant mortality rate and average life expectancy hovering between 30 and 40 years hammered this point home. Childhood wasn't just a fleeting stage. It was a narrow window you had to escape through to even make it to adulthood. And adulthood itself, a steep, uphill battle marked by exhaustion, hunger, and injuries. The daily gamble of "will I survive this day" wasn't just a question. It was the reality weighing on everyone. This constant presence of death shaped how medieval society functioned. People lived knowing their time could be cut short for reasons entirely outside their control. Maybe that's why medieval culture often leaned so heavily on faith, the afterlife, and the hope that some suffering might serve a higher purpose. When there were no vaccines, no hospitals, and no answers for why some died and others lived, faith was all you had left. So here you are, struggling with the weight of a single day in the Middle Ages, scratching away fleas, braving rotten water, and working until your arms and legs feel ready to give out, only to realize that none of it guarantees tomorrow. Life itself was a triumph, survival a daily contest where the rules felt impossibly stacked against you. And yet, people endured. They lived. They celebrated small victories. And somehow they carried humanity forward through at least 1,000 years of challenges we can barely imagine today. But survival wasn't just physical. It was emotional too. Each small break in the chain could unravel everything, which makes one thing painfully clear. To live in medieval times was less about thriving and more about surviving against the impossible odds set by disease, hunger, and sheer bad luck. But before you romanticize this endurance as some sort of badge of honor, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, could you carry this weight every single day of your life? Could you wake up knowing that anything and everything around you, from a tiny cut to a sip of water, might mean the end? As our medieval day draws closer to its dark realities, one thing is certain. Brutal doesn't even begin to describe it. Death lurked everywhere, and every decision, no matter how small, was a fragile step through its shadow. But even against those odds, life continued. By now, the extremes of survival are starting to settle in, but we're not done yet. Let's take one last deep breath and look back at this endurance test for what it really was. The Middle Ages weren't an era of romantic knights and fairy tale castles. They were a brutal endurance test for survival. Every aspect of daily life, from scratchy clothing and rotting teeth to polluted water and unrelenting labor, served as a reminder of just how harsh the world could be. It wasn't built for comfort. It was about survival against filthy, cruel, and deeply unfair odds. Appreciate the luxuries you have now. Indoor plumbing, antibiotics, and safe water were unimaginable back then. And next time the Middle Ages cross your mind, give your modern world and the ancestors who endured all this a quiet thank you.